In the long and distant ages before betrayal became legend, before brother raised blade against brother, there was an era remembered only in fragments of fading record and half-mythic remembrance. It was a time when the stars themselves seemed within humanity's grasp, when the void between worlds felt less like an abyss and more like a road waiting to be traveled. This was the early age of the Great Crusade, an age of reunion, of purpose, and of a unity so vast that it reshaped the destiny of a species. Old Earth, cradle of mankind, had endured long centuries of isolation and ruin before that era began. Storms had raged not only across its scarred continents but within the tides of the immaterial sea beyond reality. Warp turbulence had cut humanity's scattered colonies off from one another, leaving distant worlds to survive alone, to decline, or to vanish entirely into silence. Knowledge was lost, empires crumbled, cultures fractured, and yet humanity endured. From this fractured beginning rose a single guiding presence, a figure both revered and distant, known to history as the Emperor of Mankind. He did not rule through loud proclamations or open displays of emotion. His authority was quiet, vast, and immovable, like gravity itself. Where others saw only the ashes of a broken species, he saw potential waiting to be rekindled. His vision extended not merely across continents, but across the stars. Under his direction, the sciences of old Earth were reforged. Technologies once buried beneath superstition and decay were reclaimed. Shipyards stirred to life. Engines capable of piercing the veil between real space and the warp were constructed once more. The dream of a united humanity, long thought impossible, began to take shape in steel, fire, and starlight. But the Emperor did not rely on machines alone. At the heart of the Great Crusade stood his greatest creations, the Space Marine Legions. Forged through arcane science and relentless discipline, these transhuman warriors were more than soldiers. They were symbols. Each legion carried not only weapons and armor, but the idea of unity, the promise that humanity could stand strong again among the stars. In those early decades, the legions were instruments of reunion rather than conquest alone. Their fleets emerged from the warp like heralds of a new dawn. Some worlds greeted them with relief, recognizing in the Imperial banners a return of long-lost kin. Others resisted, hardened by generations of isolation, fearful of distant authority. Yet even in war, the stated purpose of the crusade remained the same, to bring scattered humanity back into a single fold. Across thousands of systems, compliance was achieved in countless ways. Diplomacy where possible, force where necessary. Always, the message was clear. Humanity's future lay not in division, but in unity beneath a single, guiding purpose. It was an age of certainty. The stars, once symbols of unreachable distance, became milestones on an expanding frontier. The Emperor himself did not often stand at the forefront of these campaigns. His presence was felt more as a distant sun than a nearby flame, constant, powerful, but far removed. He entrusted much of the Crusade's momentum to his sons, the Primarchs, towering figures of legend whose rediscovery across the galaxy became turning points in the Imperium's rise. Each Primarch brought with him not only strategic brilliance, but a distinct character that shaped his legion. Together, they formed a brotherhood unlike any before or since, generals, governors, explorers, and warriors bound by blood and purpose. In those years, their loyalty to the Emperor was not questioned. It was a given, as natural as a pull of a world's gravity. The Imperium they built expanded with astonishing speed. New trade routes connected rediscovered human civilizations. Lost technologies were gathered and catalogued. Cultures once separated by light years began to see themselves as part of a greater whole. There was hardship, certainly, and war was never far away, but beneath it all ran a deep current of confidence. Humanity, it seemed, had survived its darkest age and was stepping into a brighter one. To those living within it, the Great Crusade did not feel like the prelude to tragedy. It felt like destiny fulfilled. Star systems once thought mythical were mapped and named. Ruined colonies were rebuilt with the aid of Imperial engineers and mechanicum adepts. Vast fleets crossed the void in carefully coordinated waves, each expedition pushing the borders of the Imperium farther outward. With every successful compliance, the idea of a unified galaxy under human rule grew less like ambition and more like inevitability. The Emperor's vision, though rarely spoken in full, was understood in broad strokes. Humanity would no longer be at the mercy of hostile Xenos empires, rogue psychers, or the unpredictable tides of the warp. Reason, order, and secular truth would replace superstition and faith. It was a future defined by control, of technology, of territory, and of mankind's own destiny. Yet for all its strength, the Imperium of that era was built upon foundations still settling into place. Communication across interstellar distances remained slow and imperfect. Warp travel, though mastered to a degree, was never entirely safe. Each fleet operated with a measure of independence, guided by overarching orders but shaped by local realities. Trust was essential. So, too, was faith, not in gods, as the Imperial truth forbade such beliefs, but in the shared mission that bound humanity together. Within the legions, camaraderie flourished. Campaigns were long, and the bonds between warriors grew deep in the quiet hours between battles. They spoke of the worlds they had seen, the peoples they had reunited with the Imperium, and the belief that they were building something that would endure for millennia. Their confidence was not arrogance, but conviction, the sense that history itself moved with them. Above them all, the Emperor remained a figure of immense distance. His attention was divided across projects of staggering scale, some visible, others known only to a select few. To most citizens of the Imperium, he was a symbol more than a man, the silent architect of a new golden age. His absence from the front lines did not diminish loyalty. If anything, it elevated him further, placing him beyond concerns of any single battlefield. In those days, few imagined that unity could ever fracture. The legions had been created for a singular purpose. The Primarchs, though different in temperament, were bound by shared origin and shared duty. The Imperium's expansion felt guided by an unseen hand, each victory another step along a path already set. And yet, history often turns not in moments of obvious crisis, but in the quiet spaces between triumphs. Even at the height of the Crusade's optimism, subtle strains existed beneath the surface. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension, and no single vision, however grand, could account for every world, every culture, every interpretation of loyalty. Distance bred autonomy. Autonomy, in time, could give rise to different perspectives on what the Imperium should become. These tensions were faint, barely perceptible against the roar of engines and the glow of newly compliant worlds. They did not yet resemble cracks, only the natural variations of a living, expanding empire. Most dismissed them as temporary growing pains, the small cost of forging unity across unimaginable distances. For now, the banners of the Imperium still flew unchallenged. The legions still fought side by side. The Primarchs still stood as exemplars of strength and leadership. The Emperor's dream still seemed not only possible, but inevitable. So the fleets continued outward, their prows pointed toward unexplored stars. Generations, ships and warships alike traveled in their wake. On countless worlds, citizens looked up at unfamiliar constellations and felt, perhaps for the first time, that they were part of something larger than their own sky. It was an age of forward motion, of horizons constantly receding, of a species convinced that its greatest days lay ahead. And in the vast silence between the stars, where ancient forces stirred beyond mortal sight, the Imperium's light shone bright and unquestioned, a beacon of order in a dark and restless galaxy. For a time, that light seemed unassailable. In the quiet observation decks of distant starships, crew members watched the slow drift of nebulae and allowed themselves to believe in a peaceful future once the work of reunion was done. On newly compliant worlds, children learned of old Earth not as a myth, but as the heart of a living empire. In the halls of the legions, warriors at rest spoke of campaigns yet to come, certain they marched toward a lasting golden age. The Great Crusade moved forward, steady and immense, like a tide that could never recede. And as the stars passed silently by the hulls of Imperial vessels, and the engines hummed with patient, tireless power, the galaxy seemed, for a fleeting moment in eternity, to be settling into order. A vast dream, shared by billions, drifted gently onward through the dark. In the measured years that followed the first great waves of expansion, the Imperium settled into a rhythm that felt almost eternal. Expeditionary fleets translated in and out of the warp with practiced precision, their arrivals no longer miracles but expectation fulfilled. Cartographers of the void revised their charts in a constant flow of updates, while astropaths whispered messages across unimaginable distances, stitching far-flung systems into a single, if fragile, conversation. On countless bridges and command decks, Officers spoke in calm, measured tones about compliance actions, supply routes, and the careful integration of newly contacted worlds. There was pride in these discussions, but it was a quiet pride, shaped by duty rather than celebration. Each successful reunion was recorded, archived, and folded into the growing structure of Imperial administration, another thread woven into a design few could see in full. For the warriors of the legions, this era was defined as much by long journeys as by battle. Months could pass within the hulls of vast warships, where training cages rang with the clash of practice blades and strategiums glowed with shifting hololithic star maps. In these intervals between wars, bonds were reinforced, traditions took root, and the identity of each legion grew clearer in the shared silence of travel. The Primarchs, luminous figures at the head of their hosts, moved from campaign to campaign like living standards around which entire crusades cohered. Their presence inspired absolute confidence. Where a Primarch walked, doubt seemed to recede, replaced by the certainty that any obstacle could be overcome through will, discipline, and unity of purpose. To many, they were the perfect expression of the Emperor's grand design, proof that humanity could rise above its fractured past. And yet the Emperor himself remained distant, his attention drawn ever inward toward labors whose scale defied ordinary comprehension. Rumors circulated in low voices among remembrancers and iterators, hints that vast works were unfolding on Terra, projects intended to secure humanity's future in ways few frontline commanders fully understood. These whispers did not breed mistrust, only reinforcing the sense that the Imperium was guided by a mind that perceived centuries as easily as others perceived days. Across compliant worlds, reconstruction followed swiftly after conquest. Mechanicum envoys established forges and data vaults, while Imperial governors oversaw censuses, infrastructure, and the careful replacement of local power structures with institutions loyal to Terra. For many populations, the change brought stability unknown for generations. Trade resumed. Piracy diminished. Long-isolated cultures found themselves connected to a network of exchange stretching farther than their ancestors had ever imagined. There were difficulties, certainly. Not every world accepted the imperial truth with ease, and not every ruler relinquished authority without resistance. But these struggles were framed as temporary turbulence along a greater ascent. Iterators traveled with the fleets, patient teachers armed not with weapons but with arguments, determined to replace superstition with reason and fear with a shared understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. Within this vast endeavor, a powerful belief took root, that the worst trials lay behind humanity, not ahead. The age of strife was remembered as a storm already weathered, its lessons learned, its dangers catalogued and contained. Confidence became a quiet companion to every voyage, every compliance, every new banner raised over a reclaimed city. The future appeared not as a threat, but as an open horizon awaiting careful stewardship. Still, the galaxy was older and more complex than any single philosophy could fully encompass. Beyond the expanding borders of the Imperium, ancient civilizations watched in silence, and in forgotten regions of space, forces moved according to motives entirely their own. Such realities were acknowledged in strategic briefings and scholarly treatises, yet they felt distant, abstract, like storms noted on a chart far from one's present course. For most who served, daily life was defined not by cosmic uncertainty but by routine. Maintenance crews tended to engines the size of cities. Scribes compiled endless logs of supplies and personnel. Navigators peered into the shifting madness of the warp with disciplined focus, guiding their vessels along routes proven by experience and faith in their training. In these labors, repetition itself became a source of reassurance. Even among the estates, whose lives were forged for war, there were moments of stillness. Some spent their rare hours of rest and contemplation, reviewing past campaigns and refining future strategies. Others maintained the rituals of their legion, honoring oaths, recounting deeds, and preserving a sense of continuity that stretched back to their earliest days of formation. These practices anchored them, reminding them that they were part of something enduring, not merely weapons cast into an endless dark. No one could see the full pattern forming across the stars, the subtle intersections of ambition, loyalty, distance, and belief. Each fleet, each legion, each newly compliant world contributed a thread to a tapestry too vast for any single observer to comprehend. Yet in that very vastness lay both strength and vulnerability, woven together so closely that they seemed, for the moment, indistinguishable. As ships drifted in silent formation above nameless suns, and the glow of distant nebulae painted their hulls in muted color, a sense of patient purpose endured. The crusade advanced, steady and assured, carrying with the unspoken assumption that unity, once achieved, would last forever. Across the void, hope traveled with them, quiet and bright, like a lantern shielded carefully against gathering night. As the Great Crusade pressed onward, its momentum seemed as constant as the turning of the stars themselves. Victory followed victory in a procession so steady that it began to feel less like a series of events and more like the natural state of the galaxy. Imperial fleets moved with quiet assurance, their courses plotted along expanding chains of compliant systems, each new world a measured step farther from the long isolation of old night. Within the Imperium's growing borders, a shared identity continued to take shape. Languages, customs, and traditions varied wildly from planet to planet, yet the presence of imperial institutions created a unifying framework. Administrators, iterators, and military governors became the visible face of a distant terror, translating grand ideals into practical governance. Over time, this steady influence began to smooth the sharp edges of difference, encouraging a sense that all these disparate peoples belonged to a single, immense civilization. For many citizens, the arrival of the Imperium marked the beginning of stability after generations of uncertainty. Trade routes brought not only goods but information, allowing worlds to glimpse life beyond their own horizons. Technologies once thought irretrievably lost were reintroduced, improving agriculture, medicine, and industry. In countless settlements, the future began to feel predictable in a way it had not for centuries. Among the legions, however, perspective remained shaped by the long view of the crusade. The Estates understood that unity was not a passive condition, but an achievement maintained through vigilance. Each campaign reminded them how easily worlds could drift into isolation, how quickly old fears could harden into resistance. Their duty was not merely to conquer, but to ensure that once brought into compliance, systems remained part of the greater whole. The Primarchs carried this responsibility with varying expressions of leadership, yet all shared a deep commitment to the Emperor's vision. Councils of war were often followed by councils of governance, where the future of newly compliant regions was discussed with careful attention. Though bred for battle, these towering figures increasingly found themselves shaping the political and cultural trajectory of entire sectors. Their decisions echoed far beyond the battlefield. Despite the outward success of the Crusade, the scale of the Imperium introduced subtle complexities. Distance imposed delays that even astropathic communication could not fully overcome. A request for guidance might take weeks or months to reach its destination, and replies longer still to return. In these gaps, commanders and governors relied on their own judgment, interpreting imperial doctrine through the lens of local circumstance. Such independence was necessary, yet it also meant that the Imperium evolved unevenly. On some worlds, the imperial truth took root quickly, embraced as a liberating alternative to superstition. On others, older beliefs persisted in quiet forms, reshaped rather than erased. Compliance was recorded, banners were raised, but beneath the surface, cultures adapted in ways that did not always align perfectly with distant expectations. These variations were rarely seen as threats. Instead, they were viewed as a natural outcome of governing a realm that spanned thousands of light years. The prevailing belief held that time, education, and continued contact would gradually harmonize these differences. Patience, after all, was considered one of the Imperium's greatest strengths. It was building not merely for a generation, but for an age. Within the fleets, life continued in its disciplined cycles. Drills, maintenance, briefings, and long stretches of warp travel created a rhythm that bordered on meditative. Veterans spoke of the Crusade not as a sequence of battles, but as a journey without a visible end, a slow unfolding of destiny. Younger warriors listened with quiet focus, absorbing not only tactics but a worldview shaped by relentless forward motion. The Emperor's absence from most campaigns remained a subject of reverent acceptance. His work elsewhere was assumed to be of such importance that it outweighed even the grand theater of the Crusade. This belief reinforced loyalty rather than weakening it. To serve in the field was to trust that a greater design was being woven elsewhere, one that would one day secure everything they fought to build. And yet, in rare moments of stillness, some began to sense the strain inherent in such vast ambition. Not as doubt, but as a quiet awareness that holding together a million worlds required more than victory alone. It required understanding, coordination, and a shared sense of purpose that could survive not only war, but peace. These thoughts surface most often during the long passages between stars, when observation decks frame the silent grandeur of the void. There, with engines humming softly and distant suns glimmering like scattered embers, even the most resolute minds could feel the weight of what had been set in motion. The Imperium was no longer an idea or a campaign. It was a living structure, immense and still growing, its future dependent on countless choices made far from terror's light. For now, confidence endured. The legions remained united. The Primarchs stood as pillars of strength. The Emperor's dream advanced system by system, carried on the prows of ships that never ceased their forward course. Yet beneath the triumph, the first faint echoes of complexity stirred, reminders that unity on such a scale was not a destination, but a condition that would always demand care. So the crusade continued, bright and unbroken in appearance, its banners lit by the glow of distant suns. And in the vast, patient dot between those lights, the Imperium's future drifted onward, shaped by hands that believed, without hesitation, that they were building something that could never fall. As the Imperium expanded ever farther from its cradle, authority became something both vast and strangely intangible. Terror remained the symbolic heart of humanity, yet for most citizens of the growing empire, it was less a place than an idea, distant, radiant, and impossibly remote. Orders still flowed outward from the throne world, but by the time they reached the frontier, they had often passed through many hands, shaped by interpretation as much as intention. This distance did not weaken loyalty. Rather, it transformed it into something abstract and deeply ingrained. Governors swore oaths to an emperor they would never see. Soldiers fought beneath banners whose origins lay half a galaxy away. Across a million different skies, the same aquila rose above fortresses, spaceports, and civic halls, a unifying symbol in a realm too large to comprehend in full. Yet symbols, however powerful, could not govern alone. In the early decades of the Great Crusade, much depended on the judgment of those placed in positions of command. Expeditionary fleet masters oversaw not only wars but the long process of integration that followed them. Compliance was rarely the end of a story. More often, it was the beginning of a delicate transition. Local power structures had to be reshaped, economies aligned with imperial standards, and populations introducing new systems of law and belief. These responsibilities weighed heavily, particularly on the Primarchs. Though created as generals, they increasingly served as architects of entire regions. Their decisions determined trade routes, defensive strategies, and the political balance of newly formed sectors. Some approached these duties with meticulous care, seeking stability above all else. Others favored bold restructuring, convinced that only decisive change could prevent future unrest. Despite their differences, all worked beneath the same assumption, that the Imperium's unity was both necessary and enduring. Few questioned whether such a vast construct might one day strain under its own scale. Success had been too consistent, the momentum too great. Every challenge overcome reinforced a belief that humanity's resurgence was not fragile, but inevitable. Still, the mechanics of empire grew more complex with every passing year. Supply lines stretched across increasing distances, vulnerable not only to external threats but to simple miscalculation. A delay in one sector could ripple outward, affecting campaigns light years away. Astropathic choirs labored without rest, their minds bridging the gulf between stars, yet even their transmissions were subject to distortion and delay. Messages sometimes arrived fragmented, requiring interpretation that introduced subtle shifts in meaning. In such an environment, clarity became a precious resource. Commanders learned to issue orders that balanced precision with flexibility, aware that local conditions might demand adaptation. Trust between distant authorities became essential, a quiet foundation beneath the visible structure of fleets and fortresses. Most of the time, that trust held firm, strengthened by shared purpose and long habit. Within the legions, this era marked a deepening of identity. Campaign followed campaign, and with each, tradition solidified. Rituals of remembrance honored fallen comrades. Tactical doctrines evolved into defining characteristics. Warriors took pride not only in their victories, but in the distinct culture of their legion, its preferred strategies, its symbols, its particular interpretation of duty. These differences were not seen as divisions. On the contrary, they were celebrated as evidence of the Imperium's richness. Each legion brought unique strengths to the wider crusade, complementing the others like components of a vast, coordinated whole. Joint campaigns reinforced a sense of brotherhood, as warriors of different legions fought side by side beneath the same stars. Above them all, the Emperor's vision remained the guiding constant. Though rarely explained in full, it was understood as a plan measured in centuries. Temporary hardships, regional tensions, and logistical challenges were all considered minor when set against the scale of what was being built. Humanity was claiming the galaxy not for a fleeting age, but for an enduring dominion grounded in reason and order. And yet, the very qualities that enabled such rapid expansion carried quiet risks. The reliance on distant judgment meant that misunderstandings could persist longer than anyone realized. A governor's interpretation of imperial doctrine might drift over time, shaped by local pressures. A fleet commander, forced to act without immediate guidance, might make decisions whose consequences would only become clear years later. None of this stemmed from disloyalty. It was simply the reality of governing an empire that spanned the stars. Most believed these were problems of growth, temporary imbalances that would settle as the Imperium matured. New institutions were proposed to improve coordination. Records were standardized. Training for administrators became more rigorous. Each reform aimed to tighten the bond between worlds, ensuring that distance did not become division. Through it all, the outward face of the crusade remained one of steady triumph. New systems were brought into compliance. Trade networks expanded. Defensive bastions secured key warp routes. To an outside observer, the Imperium appeared stronger with each passing year, its structure solidifying into something that might truly last for ages. But strength on such a scale was not a single, unbreakable pillar. It was a network of countless connections, political, cultural, logistical, and personal. So long as those connections held, the Imperium advanced like an unstoppable tide. If they ever frayed, the consequences would not be immediate collapse, but something slower and more complicated. For now, however, such thoughts remained distant, overshadowed by the demands of the present. Fleets continued their voyages. Governors issued decrees. Legions marched beneath unfamiliar constellations, certain that they were securing a future in which humanity would never again be alone or divided. And across the vast reaches of the galaxy, the Imperium's light spread steadily outward, brilliant and confident, even as the responsibilities required to sustain it grew heavier with every world brought beneath its rule. In the outward stillness of imperial progress, deeper currents were beginning to move, subtle and slow, like shifts in a vast ocean that few aboard its surface could feel. The Great Crusade remained a triumph in every measurable sense. Borders expanded. Records swelled with newly compliant systems. The banners of the Imperium flew over cities that had not known contact with terror in thousands of years. Yet beneath the rhythm of advance, the effort required to sustain such momentum grew heavier, more complex, and increasingly dependent on fragile threads of coordination. The legions felt this weight in ways seldom spoken aloud. Campaigns no longer ended with simple departure toward the next war zone. Instead, they were often followed by prolonged periods of oversight, where Staats commanders were asked to remain in system while civil authorities established lasting control. Warriors bred for decisive action found themselves navigating matters of governance, arbitration, and cultural reconciliation. They performed these duties with discipline, yet the contrast between battlefield clarity and political nuance was not lost on them. For the Primarchs, the burden was greater still. Each one commanded not only armies, but the expectations of entire regions. Worlds looked to them as embodiments of imperial will, figures whose presence carried both military authority and symbolic reassurance. Requests for intervention, judgment, and guidance multiplied as the Imperium grew. Though possessed of immense intellect and resolve, even they could not be everywhere at once. Choices had to be made about which crises demanded personal attention, and which must be entrusted to subordinates. Distance amplified every decision. A problem left unattended for months could evolve in unforeseen ways. Minor disputes over trade or jurisdiction sometimes deepened into entrenched rivalries before news reached high command. Astropathic warnings arrived colored by interference from the warp, their meanings occasionally blurred. In this environment, the Imperium relied not only on strength, but on interpretation, patience, and trust in those far removed from direct oversight. Among the civilian arms of the crusade, similar pressures mounted. Administrators tasked with integrating new worlds often work with incomplete information about local histories and customs. Efforts to standardize law and production sometimes clash with traditions that had sustained isolated populations for generations. Iterators preached the imperial truth with calm conviction, yet the pace of cultural change varied widely. Compliance on record did not always mean unity in spirit. None of this was seen as failure. Rather, it was framed as a natural friction of transformation on a galactic scale. Reports emphasized progress, highlighting improved output, restored infrastructure, and rising levels of interstellar exchange. These were genuine achievements, visible and measurable. They reinforce a belief that the Imperium's challenges were temporary obstacles along an upward path, not signs of deeper strain. Within the fleets, long voyages continued to shape the inner lives of those who served. In the quiet hours between duties, conversations sometimes turned to the future that would follow the Crusade's end. Some imagined a time when the legions would stand as guardians rather than conquerors, preserving a peace they had helped create. Others found it difficult to picture such an era, having known only endless advance from one war zone to the next. These reflections remained private, more contemplative than contentious. The Emperor's absence from the front line persisted as a distant, guiding constant. His focus on unseen labors was accepted as necessary for the Imperium's ultimate security. Trust in his vision bridged the emotional distance, allowing faith in a future few fully understood. That faith was one of the strongest bonds holding the Crusade together, an unspoken assurance that every sacrifice served a design of enduring purpose. Yet even the strongest bonds require careful tending. The Imperium's unity rested not only on shared ideals, but on the relationships between its leaders, the understanding between legions, and the delicate balance of authority across unimaginable distances. These connections held firm, but they were no longer simple. They formed a web of obligations, expectations, and interpretations that grew denser with every passing year. To most, the Crusade still felt unstoppable, its course as certain as a movement of the stars. But like any great structure built across shifting ground, its stability depended on countless unseen supports. For now, those supports bore the weight. The fleet sailed on. The legions fought and governed in turn. New worlds joined the fold beneath the promise of a shared destiny. And in the quiet spaces between victories, where the hum of engines blended with the soft glow of distant suns, the Imperium moved forward, immense and resolute, unaware how much it already depended on the careful balance of forces few had yet begun to question. In the advancing centuries of the Great Crusade, the Imperium's growth began to resemble a living thing, vast and complex, its countless parts moving in patterns too large for any single mind to follow. What had once been a series of bold expeditions was now an interwoven network of campaigns, occupations, and reconstructions unfolding simultaneously across thousands of light years. From a distance, it still appeared seamless. Up close, the effort required to sustain that appearance was immense. Every new compliance added not only territory, but responsibility. World did not simply join the Imperium and become identical to those that had come before. Each carried its own history, its own expectations, its own quiet resistances. Administrators worked tirelessly to align systems of governance, taxation, and production with imperial standards, yet the pace of change varied. Some populations adapted swiftly, eager for stability. Others adjusted more slowly, their loyalties layered and complex. For the legions, these subtleties formed the backdrop to an existence still defined by duty. They moved from war zone to war zone with disciplined precision, yet increasingly found themselves returning to previously conquered systems to resolve unrest or reinforce imperial presence. Victory, they learned, was not a single moment but a condition that required maintenance. Garrisons were established. Advisors remained behind. The work of unity proved ongoing. The Primarchs bore this reality with solemn resolve. Their roles expanded beyond strategy and warfare into long-term stewardship. Councils convened not only to plan assaults, but to discuss trade routes, planetary defenses, and the integration of local elites into imperial hierarchies. Each decision shaped the future character of entire regions. Though bred for conquest, they now stood as guardians of a growing order whose complexity rivaled the wars that had birthed it. Across the fleets, communication became both lifeline and limitation. Astropathic choirs labored in shifts without pause, transmitting orders, reports, and pleas for assistance across the Imperium's shifting tides. Messages arrived bearing the weight of urgency, yet often lacking context. Commanders learned to read between fragmented lines, to act decisively despite incomplete understanding. In this way, the Imperium functioned less like a single voice and more like a chorus striving to remain in harmony. Among ordinary citizens of the expanding realm, life slowly changed in ways both profound and subtle. Markets filled with goods from distant stars. Off-world travel, once a myth, became an attainable reality for a small but growing number. Children learned of the Imperium not as an abstract authority, but as a tangible presence shaping education, law, and opportunity. For many, these changes brought genuine hope, a sense that humanity's scattered fragments were becoming whole again. Yet hope, like unity, required careful tending. Cultural differences did not vanish overnight. On some worlds, old identities persisted beneath the surface of imperial compliance, expressed in private customs and quiet traditions. Officials often tolerated these so long as order was maintained, believing that over generations, shared experience would foster deeper alignment. This patience was seen as strength, evidence that the Imperium could endure diversity without fracturing. Within the legions, long service fostered reflection. Veterans who had fought since the earliest days of the Crusade began to sense the passage of an era. They had witnessed humanity's rebirth among the stars, seen lost worlds return to the fold, and stood beside brothers in battles that reshaped history. Pride remained strong, but it was tempered by awareness that what they were building was no longer fragile in the way it once had been. It was vast, and that vastness carried its own gravity. Still, confidence endured. The Emperor's vision, though distant, remained the guiding star by which all navigated. His unseen labors were trusted to secure the Imperium's ultimate future, while his sons carried forward the visible work of expansion. Together, they formed a structure of belief as much as governance, one that spanned from Terra's golden halls to the furthest frontier outpost. And so the Crusade continued, immense and deliberate, its progress measured not only in conquered systems but in the slow weaving together of a civilization spread across the stars. In the quiet hum of starship engines and the steady glow of newly lit beacons along secure warp routes, there was a sense of enduring motion, not hurried, not reckless, but persistent. Humanity was no longer merely surviving. It was shaping the galaxy, one careful, heavy step at a time. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned generations of mortal lives, its advance felt less like a campaign and more like the natural motion of history itself. The Imperium had grown so vast that entire sectors now knew only its rule, their populations born into a reality where the Emperor's authority was as constant as the rising of their local suns. The memory of isolation faded into distant legend, replaced by a quiet assumption that humanity had always been meant to stand united among the stars. Yet expansion did not slow. Even as regions behind the frontiers settled into structured governance, new expeditions pushed ever outward. The maps of the galaxy, once scattered with blank spaces, continued to fill with routes, designations, and imperial sigils. Each edition was recorded with careful precision, as though naming a system and charting its stars helped secure its place within the greater whole. Within the fleets at the edge of known space, there was a particular atmosphere, a blend of routine and anticipation. Veterans who had seen dozens of campaigns stood beside younger warriors experiencing their first distant suns. The sense of purpose remained unshaken. Every translation into real space carried the possibility of rediscovering lost kin or confronting threats that had lurked undisturbed for millennia. Both outcomes were accepted as part of the same duty. The Primarchs continued to serve as anchors in this endless motion. Their presence on the frontier symbolized the Emperors were made manifest, a reassurance that even at the edge of mapped space, the Imperium remained whole. They spoke not of personal glory, but of responsibility, to their legions, to the worlds depending on imperial protection, and to a future they believed would justify every hardship endured in the present. Behind them, the machinery of empire labored without rest. Supply convoys traced long arcs between core systems and distant war zones, carrying munitions, machinery, and the countless small necessities that sustained fleets on extended deployment. Administrators tracked ties and production quotas, ensuring that prosperity in one region could support stability in another. The Imperium's strength lay not only in its armies, but in these invisible flows of resources and information. Even so, the scale of these operations introduced a quiet fragility. A disrupted route or delayed shipment could ripple outward, forcing adjustments across multiple sectors. Such disruptions were rarely catastrophic, yet they required constant attention. The Imperium endured through adaptation as much as force, its leaders learning to respond to shifting circumstances with patience and measured resolve. Among ordinary citizens on distant worlds, the Imperium often appeared as a distant but benevolent presence. News of great victories traveled slowly, yet when it arrived, it reinforced a belief that humanity's dominion was expanding steadily and securely. Festivals marked the arrival of imperial envoys. Monuments were raised to commemorate compliance and unity. Over time, these rituals wove the idea of the Imperium into daily life, making it not an external authority, but a shared identity. For the Estates, whose lives stretched far beyond those of the people it protected, the passage of time was felt differently. They saw worlds change between visits, cities rise where once there had been ruins, and generations grow beneath the peace their campaigns had secured. These observations fostered a quiet satisfaction, a sense that their endless marches were shaping something lasting. Yet they also served as reminders of the Imperium's sheer scale, a realm too vast for any single warrior to truly know. The Emperor's vision remained a unifying constant, a distant light guiding every decision. Though his physical presence was rarely felt beyond terror, his purpose permeated the crusade. To question it seemed as impossible as questioning the need for air or gravity. The Imperium existed because he had willed it into being, and it advanced because that will endured. Still, as the frontier stretched ever farther and the responsibilities of governance deepened, the Crusade's nature continued to evolve. What had begun as a mission of reunification was becoming the ongoing stewardship of a civilization already larger than any before it. The work of holding together what had been won began to rival the effort required to win it in the first place. Yet none of this dimmed the prevailing sense of destiny. The fleet sailed on beneath unfamiliar constellations, their hulls reflecting the light of stars few humans had ever seen. On countless bridges, officers watched those stars drift past viewports and felt the steady reassurance of shared purpose. The Imperium moved forward, vast and confident, its course set toward horizons that seemed forever just beyond reach. And in that endless motion, amid the hum of engines and the soft glow of navigation hololiths, humanity's great endeavor continued. Not with haste, not with doubt, but with a calm certainty of a power that believed its future was as boundless as the galaxy itself. By the time the Imperium had spanned a breadth of space once thought unreachable, its continued existence began to feel inevitable. Generations had now lived and died beneath its banners, their lives shaped by structures established during the earliest years of the Great Crusade. What had begun as a bold endeavor of reunion had matured into a vast and functioning order, its processes so deeply embedded that many could no longer imagine a galaxy without it. This sense of permanence was one of the Crusade's greatest strengths. It lent confidence to governors making decisions on distant worlds, to fleet masters plotting courses into uncharted regions, and to citizens who entrusted their futures to imperial protection. Stability, even when hard-won, creates the impression that it has always existed. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the improbable becomes expected. Across countless systems, daily life continued with quiet regularity. Cargo haulers arrived on schedule. Astropathic dispatches delivered news of distant sectors. Administrators reviewed census data and production reports, adjusting quotas and resource allocations with practiced efficiency. For those immersed in these routines, the Imperium was less a grand ideal than a practical framework within which life unfolded. The legions, too, moved within patterns that had grown familiar. Campaigns still erupted along the frontier, yet they were framed as part of a continuous effort rather than singular defining events. Victory was assumed to follow preparation and discipline, as reliably as dawn follows night. This confidence was not careless, but it was deeply ingrained, reinforced by decades of success. The Primarchs embodied this era of assured purpose. Their authority, once forged in the fires of rediscovery and initial conquest, had matured into something steadier. They oversaw not only wars, but the long-term security of entire regions. Defensive networks were established. Training academies for planetary militias were founded. Systems once reliant on legion presence learned gradually to stand on their own, guided by imperial doctrine. Behind this steady progress, however, lay an assumption rarely spoken aloud, that the Imperium's unity, once achieved, would naturally endure. Effort was directed toward expansion and administration, while the deeper question of how such a vast realm might change over time received less attention. Continuity was expected, not debated. This expectation shaped the culture of the Crusade. Officers and officials planned for decades ahead, confident that the structures they built would remain intact. Infrastructure was designed with permanence in mind. Orbital docks intended to serve for centuries. Archives meant to preserve knowledge indefinitely. The future was viewed as an extension of the present, stable and predictable. Yet permanence in a living empire is never absolute. The Imperium's cohesion depended on countless human choices, on trust between distant leaders, and on the ongoing alignment of ideals across a realm too large for any one perspective to encompass. These bonds held, but they required renewal through shared purpose and clear understanding. Subtle variations in interpretation began to emerge, not as open disagreements, but as differences in emphasis. One sector might prioritize rapid industrial expansion, while another focused on cultural integration. A legion commander might value strict central oversight, while a planetary governor advocated greater local autonomy within imperial law. None of these positions directly contradicted the emperor's vision, yet together they formed a spectrum of approaches that grew broader with time. Such diversity could be a source of resilience, allowing the Imperium to adapt to varied conditions. It could also introduce quiet friction, especially when communication lagged or context was lost across interstellar distances. Most of the time, these differences were resolved through negotiation and mutual respect. The shared memory of humanity's long isolation still encouraged cooperation over conflict. Within the fleets traveling the farthest reaches, the sense of building something lasting remained strong. Crews looked upon newly charted stars and imagined the generations who would one day call those systems home. The idea that their efforts might lay foundation for millennia was a source of calm pride. They were not merely fighting wars. They were shaping the stage upon which humanity's future would unfold. The Emperor's distant presence continued to anchor this belief. His vision was regarded as a bedrock upon which all else stood, a guiding principle that transcended individual interpretations. Even without direct oversight, his authority provided a common reference point, a reminder that the Imperium existed for a purpose greater than any single campaign or sector. And so the Crusade advanced, wrapped in the quiet assurance of its own success. The Imperium's light spread steadily, its systems interlinked by trade, communication, and shared identity. From the perspective of those living within it, this order felt enduring, almost timeless, a structure too vast and too carefully built to ever truly falter. In the calm between battles, beneath the slow drift of unfamiliar constellations, that belief settled gently into the hearts of millions. The Imperium seemed permanent, its future stretching forward in an unbroken line. And in that certainty, as fleets sailed on through the dark, few paused to consider how even the strongest structures must be continually tended, lest unseen strains gather in the spaces no one thinks to watch. As the Imperium's reach extended ever farther, the challenge of distance became not merely a logistical concern, but a defining feature of its existence. Between one system and the next lay expanses so great that even the swiftest warp voyages demanded patience, and every message sent across the immaterium carried with it the risk of distortion. The Imperium endured not because distance was conquered, but because it was managed with discipline, ritual, and trust. Communication formed the invisible nervous system of this vast realm. Astropathic choirs, scattered across thousands of worlds and starships, labored in constant communion with the warp. Their minds reached outward in fragile threads of thought, bearing orders, reports, and fragments of news from regions most citizens would never see. Each transmission was an act of endurance, a reminder that unity required effort at every level. These messages shaped the perceptions of those who received them. A governor on a distant world might learn of victories light years away and take reassurance that the Imperium's strength remained undiminished. A fleet commander might receive a plea for aid from a neighboring sector, altering the course of an entire campaign. Information did not simply describe the Imperium. It actively shaped its movements, guiding decisions made far from their origin. Yet communication across such distances could never be perfect. Signals arrived incomplete, colored by interference or delayed by warp turbulence. Meaning had to be inferred, context supplied by experience and assumption. Most of the time, this system functioned well enough. The shared framework of imperial doctrine provided a common language through which even fragmentary messages could be understood. Within this environment, the role of interpretation grew increasingly important. Senior officers, administrators, and Legion commanders became accustomed to acting on partial knowledge, balancing adherence to standing orders with the realities before them. They trusted that others elsewhere in the Imperium were making similar judgments, all guided by the same overarching purpose. In this way, unity was maintained not through constant oversight, but through parallel acts of faith. Among the legions, this reliance on distant communication reinforced their sense of autonomy within loyalty. A legion might operate for months without direct contact from Terra, prosecuting campaigns according to established principles and the guidance of its Primarch. This independence was not rebellion. It was necessity, born of the vast scale on which the Crusade unfolded. Still, it meant that each legion's experience of the Imperium was shaped primarily by its own journey through the stars. Over time, these experiences formed distinct perspectives. A legion campaigning in densely populated regions might grow accustomed to complex negotiations and layered politics. Another, fighting along harsh frontiers, might see the galaxy as a place of constant threat requiring uncompromising strength. Both served the same Imperium, yet their day-to-day realities differed profoundly. Such differences remained largely unspoken, softened by shared victories and mutual respect. Joint operations and councils of war allowed commanders to exchange ideas and maintain a sense of common identity. The Primarchs, in particular, served as bridges between these varied viewpoints, their gatherings opportunities to reaffirm bonds of brotherhood and shared mission. For ordinary citizens, the Imperium's vastness was most often experienced through stories. News from afar, relayed through official proclamations or traveler accounts, painted a picture of a realm in steady ascent. Tales of newly rediscovered human civilizations, of alien threats driven back into the void, and of great leaders guiding humanity's destiny circulated widely. These narratives reinforce a collective belief in progress and stability. Yet the very act of storytelling introduced its own simplifications. Complex events became clear victories. Lingering tensions were described as resolved. The Imperium's challenges were acknowledged, but often framed as obstacles already overcome. This was not deliberate deception, but the natural tendency of distant communication to favor clarity over nuance. In the quiet spaces where messages were sent and received, the Imperium's unity depended on trust. Trust that orders reflected the Emperor's vision, that reports were given in good faith, and that distant allies acted with the same dedication as those nearby. For decades, this trust held firm, strengthened by shared success in the absence of any true internal rival. So the web of communication stretched ever wider, its strands linking worlds that would never see one another's skies. Through these tenuous connections flowed the lifeblood of a civilization spread across the galaxy. As long as the signals endured, as long as voices continued to answer across the dark, the Imperium remained a single entity in spirit as well as name. And in the steady whisper of astropathic choirs, in the flicker of signal lights on distant bridges, humanity's great empire spoke to itself across the stars, convinced that its shared purpose would always be enough to hold the vastness together. As the Great Crusade stretched into countless systems, a quiet tension began to settle beneath the surface of the Imperium's outward triumph. Expansion had brought with it a sense of inevitability, a confidence that humanity's unity was assured by the combined strength of fleets, legions, and governors. Yet even the most disciplined warriors and administrators could not escape the subtle weight of distance, nor the awareness that in some corners of the galaxy no voice would reach them in time to guide or warn. On the frontier, worlds remained isolated not merely by warp distance, but by circumstance. Rogue currents, dead sectors, and uncharted anomalies created gaps where the Imperial presence was thin or intermittent. Within these spaces, compliance could take on different meanings. Some populations embraced imperial authority eagerly, while others adopted it with hesitation, keeping old beliefs alive in ways that rarely surfaced beyond local scrutiny. For those assigned to govern or patrol such regions, the silence beyond the reach of astropaths was both a challenge and a source of unease. The legions, though vast and disciplined, were not immune to this subtle strain. Campaigns often required months of transit through unpopulated or contested space, where no signals returned and no familiar systems could be sighted. On these journeys, officers and warriors confronted the scale of the galaxy in a tangible way, a measure of isolation against which even the might of a Primarch felt insufficient. The absence of immediate oversight, combined with a persistent need to act decisively, fostered a constant awareness of responsibility. Every choice carried weight beyond the immediate moment, influencing outcomes far removed in space and time. Primarchs, aware of the unique burden their sons carried, exercised guidance both directly and indirectly. They moved strategically among fleets and newly compliant systems, setting standards, advising commanders, and asserting the Emperor's intent. Their presence was both reassurance and anchor, a reminder that even across unimaginable distances, the Imperium's vision remained coherent. Still, even the Primarchs could not be everywhere, and the gaps between their interventions reveal how much relied on trust, the trust placed in officers, administrators, and even ordinary citizens to uphold the principles of unity and order. Within these conditions, the flow of information became a matter of survival. Astropathic networks hummed ceaselessly, sending vital reports, requests, and warnings across light years of void. Signals were intercepted, misread, or delayed, yet even in imperfection they were indispensable. Entire campaigns could hinge upon the correct interpretation of a single message. Commanders learned to act decisively with incomplete data to anticipate potential consequences and to weigh risks against the imperative of the mission. In this way, the Imperium functioned as much through judgment and intuition as through codified orders. For populations newly integrated into imperial governance, the weight of silence was felt differently. They received messages, envoys, and decrees, yet the full scope of the Imperium's presence remained abstract. Citizens might learn of distant victories or threats through official reports or traveling emissaries, yet rarely did they comprehend the sheer scale of what bound the galaxy together. To them, the Imperium was vast, constant, and untouchable, a distant authority that existed more as a guiding principle than a tangible reality. This perception reinforced loyalty but also nurtured complacency. The systems closest to the frontier often developed self-sufficient structures that operated according to imperial ideals, yet without constant oversight, the potential for deviation increased. Governors, military commanders, and administrators alike understood that the appearance of unity required vigilance as much as enforcement. The larger the empire became, the more fragile that appearance could grow beneath the weight of silence. Within the legions, quiet reflection often accompanied moments of rest during long warp transits. Warriors contemplated the implications of scale, the meaning of loyalty, and the limits of their influence. They witnessed the transformation of worlds under their care and noted that success was not always immediately visible. Cities rose, economies stabilized, and populations adapted. Yet subtle tensions persisted, woven into the very fabric of the Imperium they served so faithfully. Even the Emperor, distant on Terra, remained aware of the fragility inherent in these gaps. His focus extended beyond conquest to the mechanisms of maintenance, the structures that ensured unity even in his absence. It was understood that vigilance, order, and foresight were required not only to achieve victory, but to preserve it. The Imperium's strength was inseparable from its ability to manage silence, to anticipate the currents of isolation, and to intervene where subtle fractures threatened cohesion. And so the Crusade continued, vast and relentless, advancing ever outward with the quiet hum of warp engines, the distant chatter of astropathic signals, and the patient labor of thousands of administrators. Across systems uncounted, humanity prospered under banners carried by loyal sons and steadfast governors. Yet even amid triumph, the weight of silence lingered, a reminder that the Imperium's unity, though immense and impressive, was never truly guaranteed. It depended upon diligence, judgment, and the unbroken flow of unseen connections that held the galaxy together in the absence of immediate oversight. In the dim glow of warp-lit corridors, amid the quiet of deep space watch stations, and in the soft hum of orbital cities, this truth persisted. The Imperium advanced not merely by strength, but by patience, vigilance, and the recognition that even in victory, the cosmos was indifferent. And as fleets sailed on into the uncharted dark, humanity's empire continued to grow, vast and confident, yet quietly balanced upon threads stretched across the void. The Great Crusade had long ceased to be a series of isolated campaigns and had grown into an immense, interconnected movement spanning countless star systems. Humanity's dominion extended across light years, uniting worlds once separated by millennia of silence and isolation. From Terra to the Altimus Frontos, the Imperium's presence was increasingly apparent, yet its vastness rendered it simultaneously distant, a constellation of authority felt more than fully understood. Within this expanse, every fleet, every legion, every governor and administrator contributed to a living network, whose strength relied as much on coordination and vigilance as it did on force. Across the newly integrated sectors, populations adapted to the rhythms of imperial life. Trade routes brought resources and knowledge, allowing societies long forgotten by the wider galaxy to flourish again. Cities rose where barren landscapes had prevailed, and the laws of the Imperium replaced the uncertainty of local custom with measured order. To the citizens of these worlds, the Imperium was both a promise and a presence, tangible in the banners that flew above orbital bastions and abstract in the distant authority of terror. For the legions, these achievements formed the backdrop to duties that were simultaneously martial and administrative. Campaigns no longer concluded with the defeat of a foe alone. Stabilization, oversight, and integration were as essential to the Crusade's success as any battlefield victory. Warriors accustomed to decisive action now learned to exercise patience, to observe, to advise, and to guide systems toward compliance without the immediate clarity of combat. These responsibilities demanded discipline of a subtler kind, a strength of mind to match the strength of arms. The Primarchs themselves embodied this duality of purpose. Though their command of battle remained unsurpassed, they increasingly found themselves balancing strategy with stewardship. They oversaw not only the alignment of planetary forces, but the construction of infrastructure, the establishment of academies, and the careful calibration of governance. Every decision had consequences that extended far beyond the horizon, and even the most minor oversight could ripple outward, shaping the future of systems the size of continents or more. Yet, for all the control exerted, the Imperium was defined by its distance. Between command and consequence lay vast expanses of space, and between intention and result stretched months or even years of travel. Astropathic networks carried messages across this gulf, their minds bridging the warp to deliver the Emperor's guidance, fleet orders, and civil reports. But signals could falter, and interpretation was required. Every leader relied on judgment as much as authority, understanding that even within the strictest structure, human action could not be entirely predicted. This interdependence of trust and discretion shaped the culture of command. Senior officers acted with authority, yet deferred to the judgment of their peers where circumstances demanded. Governors assumed responsibility for interpreting imperial edicts within local contexts. Legion commanders balanced loyalty with initiative, exercising decisions that could affect millions. Across all levels, the Imperium functioned through this complex lattice of expectation, respect, and shared purpose, bound together by the certainty that the Emperor's vision transcended individual concerns. Amid this vast machinery, the Crusade continued to expand, its fleets carrying humanity into ever more distant regions. Planets were charted, mapped, and catalogued. Systems long abandoned or lost to isolation were rediscovered, their populations reintegrated into a growing network of commerce, defense, and cultural exchange. Every discovery, every compliance, reinforced a sense of inexorability that had become a defining feature of this era. Humanity did not simply survive in the galaxy, it reshaped it. Yet, beneath this apparent certainty, the vastness of the Imperium introduced subtle tensions. Local traditions endured despite imperial presence. Divergent interpretations of doctrine persisted. The sheer scale of administration left gaps where oversight could not immediately reach. These were not flaws, but natural outcomes of governing a civilization spread across an entire galaxy. Leaders accepted them as challenges to be monitored, mitigated, and, when necessary, gently corrected. Even as the Imperium grew, the legions maintained cohesion through shared purpose and ritual. Bonds forged in the fires of early campaigns endured, tempered by time and reinforced through collective duty. Each warrior understood that their strength alone was insufficient. Unity was essential. This awareness shaped interactions not only among themselves, but with the populations they oversaw. Discipline, honor, and vigilance were principles not only of battle but of governance, the threads that held together the sprawling tapestry of humanity. The Emperor, distant on terror, remained the unseen center of this vast endeavor. His will informed every edict, every campaign, every gesture of policy. Though rarely present in person, his authority was absolute, a guiding force shaping choices across light years. The Imperium's leaders, aware of this omnipresent expectation, carried out their duties with steady focus, understanding that loyalty to him meant both obedience and careful judgment. And so the crusade moved onward, across constellations unknown, guided by the distant glow of stars that bore witness to humanity's resurgence. In the hum of engines, the flicker of hololithic displays, and the whispered counsel of astropaths, a sense of purpose endured, quiet, resolute, and patient. Humanity's empire stretched outward, immense and unbroken, and beneath the brilliance of distant suns, the Imperium continued to shape its destiny, one careful step at a time, its vastness both a triumph and a constant reminder of the vigilance required to maintain it. Even in an era defined by expansion and triumph, the Imperium's advance carried with it subtle shadows, quiet reminders that even the most meticulously constructed order was not without challenge. The Great Crusade had brought countless worlds into compliance, knit together civilizations once separated by isolation, and restored hope to systems long lost to the dark. Yet with every victory came the realization that distance, scale, and complexity could never be entirely overcome. Even as fleets and legions moved forward, there were spaces where oversight was delayed, where decisions relied on judgment rather than certainty, and where the smallest misalignment might grow unnoticed. The legions, though vast and disciplined, encountered these challenges in both expected and unforeseen ways. Campaigns frequently unfolded in regions where geography, culture, or even warp turbulence complicated straightforward action. Success depended not only on strength, but on observation, patience, and the willingness to adapt. Commanders learned to read the subtle signs of unrest, to detect the faintest indications of instability, and to guide systems toward harmony without imposing it too forcefully. In this way, discipline was matched by insight, and obedience was tempered by understanding. For the Primarchs, the weight of responsibility was unceasing. They oversaw not only the immediate necessities of war, but the long-term consequences of integration. Defensive networks, trade routes, and cultural institutions fell under their purview as much as battle plans. Every campaign carried a dual purpose: to secure a world and to ensure that the structures which permitted it to endure were firmly established. Their vision extended beyond the immediate horizon, encompassing centuries, generations, and the patterns of societies yet to be born. Communication remained the Imperium's most vital tool, and its most fragile asset. Astropathic messages bridged impossible distances, yet even they could be distorted by the turbulence of the warp. Signals often arrived incomplete or ambiguous, demanding interpretation by those receiving them. A single error could ripple across sectors, requiring adjustment and correction. Leadership became an exercise in managing not only forces and resources, but also uncertainty, trust, and expectation. Success rested as much on foresight and judgment as on strength of arms. Within populations recently brought into imperial compliance, subtle currents of difference persisted. Many adapted readily to new governance, trading networks, and imperial law. Others retained old practices, quietly embedding them within the structures imposed from afar. Compliance on record did not always reflect uniformity of belief, and officers tasked with oversight learned to observe and respond to these variations carefully. The Imperium's unity relied on these small adjustments, recognizing that the strength of a civilization was as much in its cohesion as in its obedience. Among the legions, quiet reflection often accompanied moments of stillness between campaigns. Warriors contemplated not only victories, but also the patterns of human behavior that lay beneath the surface of conquest. They considered the endurance of loyalty, the persistence of culture, and the subtle influence of distance. In these contemplations, the enormity of the Imperium's task became apparent. It was not enough to conquer. One had to sustain, protect, and harmonize. Every legionnaire, from the most seasoned veteran to the youngest recruit, contributed to a structure larger than any single fleet or system. The Emperor, distant upon terror, remained the unifying principle guiding all these efforts. His will shaped campaigns, doctrines, and the overarching vision of humanity's resurgence. Though rarely present in the fleets themselves, his authority provided the touchstone by which leaders, governors, and warriors measured their actions. The sense of purpose derived from his guidance fostered confidence, even in the vast and uncertain spaces of the frontier. His absence was not a weakness, but a demonstration of trust in those who carried his mandate across the stars. And yet, for all the order imposed and achieved, the Imperium scale introduced unavoidable tensions. Distance created gaps. Interpretation introduced variation. Decisions, even when guided by loyalty and insight, produced outcomes that could not always be anticipated. These tensions were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they existed like quiet currents beneath a calm sea. Observant officers noted them, but for most, they were absorbed into routine, mitigated by the discipline, structure, and trust that held the galaxy together. As fleets sailed through unfamiliar constellations, their hulls reflecting the dim light of distant suns, there was a pervasive sense of careful purpose. Every movement, every translation, every deployment were conducted with awareness of both immediate consequence and long-term effect. The Imperium's triumphs were not merely martial. They were the product of patience, judgment, and the continuous weaving of human and logistical effort across a scale almost impossible to perceive in its entirety. And in that quiet vigilance, amid the hum of engines, the glow of navigation hololiths, and the soft murmur of astropathic signals, humanity's empire advanced steadily, immense and confident, yet conscious of the subtle currents that flowed beneath its triumphs. Shadows lingered along the path, not as threat, but as reminder that even in the greatest endeavors, care, foresight, and constant attention were as necessary as strength and courage. The Imperium endured, vast and unbroken, moving forward beneath the quiet glow of countless distant suns, ever aware that the web holding it together required constant vigilance to remain whole. As the Great Crusade continued its relentless sweep across the galaxy, the scale of humanity's dominion became almost incomprehensible. Stars once distant and unattainable were now within reach, their systems charted, catalogued, and integrated into the ever-expanding network of the Imperium. Yet for all the certainty of achievement, there remained an intangible quality to the frontier, a sense that beyond every newly compliant world lay regions still unclaimed, mysteries still hidden, and challenges as vast as the space separating them from terror. The legions, accustomed to unbroken momentum, adapted to this enduring reality. Campaigns were no longer singular events but ongoing processes, with each conquest accompanied by the careful task of governance. Systems brought into compliance required oversight, training, and the integration of local populations into the structures of imperial law and society. Victory was thus measured not solely by the submission of worlds, but by the enduring stability and order that followed. The work of the legions, once focused almost entirely on battle, increasingly encompassed stewardship, guidance, and the subtle art of shaping civilization itself. The Primarchs carried this dual responsibility with deliberate care. Beyond leading their sons in war, they oversaw the construction of infrastructure, the establishment of planetary defenses, and the alignment of cultures within the broader vision of the Imperium. Their presence reassured both warriors and civilians alike, a tangible manifestation of the Emperor's will across vast distances. Each decision made in councils of war or diplomacy echoed through the centuries, shaping economies, military readiness, and even the philosophical frameworks of entire societies. Communication remained the lifeblood of this sprawling empire. Astropathic networks bridged gaps of light years, transmitting orders, reports, and intelligence with remarkable efficiency, though never without risk of misinterpretation. Signals could falter, messages might arrive incomplete, and meaning often depended on the judgment of those receiving them. Commanders, governors, and administrators were thus required to act decisively in the absence of certainty, their decisions guided by experience, precedent, and an understanding of the Emperor's broader vision. In this way, the Imperium functioned through both authority and trust, a web of responsibility spanning the stars. The vastness of the frontier created both opportunity and challenge. Worlds distant from the main arteries of imperial oversight were often left to develop local practices that, while aligned with compliance, diverged subtly from doctrine. Some adopted imperial infrastructure and trade systems with eagerness, embracing the promise of stability and connection. Others maintained traditions, embedding older cultural norms into the structures imposed from afar. These differences rarely produced open conflict, but they were a reminder that the Imperium's unity was a living condition, dependent upon observation, guidance, and the careful balance of influence. Within the legions, the scale of responsibility fostered reflection. Warriors contemplated the long-term consequences of their actions, the delicate nature of trust, and the invisible threads connecting distant sectors. For many, the understanding that they were shaping civilizations across millennia instilled both pride and solemnity. The crusade was more than conquest. It was an exercise in enduring care, in sustaining stability across distances so vast that even the strongest fleets could scarcely span them in a single lifetime. Civilians within the expanding Imperium often experienced its authority as both distant and immediate. They observed the construction of orbital facilities, the arrival of trade convoys, and the presence of garrisons, all symbols of a governance that extended across incomprehensible space. News of victories and discoveries filtered through astropathic channels or traveling envoys, creating a sense that humanity's dominion was both unassailable and inevitable. Yet even as the Imperium's light spread, shadows of distance reminded them that not every outcome could be directly observed or controlled. The Emperor's guiding presence continued to unify these disparate experiences. Though absent from the front lines, his authority and vision permeated every aspect of governance, strategy, and societal organization. Leadership within the legions and the civil administration were conducted in deference to that distant will, a recognition that the continuity of the Imperium depended on faith, judgment, and fidelity as much as force. The Emperor's purpose was both tangible in the victories of his sons and abstract in the enduring structure of the Empire itself. Even as the Imperium expanded, the horizon remained infinite. Beyond each newly charted system lay stars yet unrecorded, civilizations untouched by the Crusade, and possibilities that could reshape understanding. This knowledge inspired both caution and determination. Leaders understood that every conquest was temporary until secured by order, that every success required continuous vigilance, and that the Imperium's permanence relied on the persistent care of those entrusted with defense and stewardship. And so the Crusade continued, vast and unwavering, its fleets moving through constellations unknown, its legions shaping societies in ways both visible and subtle. Beneath the steady glow of distant suns, the Imperium advanced, immense, confident, and patient. Humanity's empire stretched onward, every step deliberate, every action measured, building not merely a collection of worlds, but a civilization whose threads spanned the stars, and whose endurance depended upon the careful attention of those who could see both the light and the darkness of the powers yet to come. As the Great Crusade entered a period of sustained growth, the Imperium's strength was both evident and quietly fragile. Across countless star systems, human civilization flourished under the guidance of the Emperor's sons, the unwavering authority of the Primarchs, and the tireless efforts of administrators, governors, and officers who maintained a web of governance spanning light years. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent stability flowed subtle currents, forces of culture, interpretation, and circumstance that could alter the character of any system if left unchecked. The legions learned that the strength of order relied not solely on conquest, but on vigilance, judgment, and constant adaptation. Campaigns were no longer measured only in battles won, but in the enduring success of integration. World brought into compliance required careful attention, their populations guided toward imperial systems of law, trade, and defense. Administrators oversaw the calibration of local economies, ensuring that planetary production supported wider networks of supply, while legions remained ready to enforce order if necessary. This delicate balance of influence, guidance, and occasional force became a defining feature of the Crusade, illustrating that true power lay as much in oversight as in arms. The Primarchs were central to this evolving structure. Though their martial skill was unmatched, their authority extended into governance, diplomacy, and the shaping of societal structures. They understood that a world's loyalty was not secured by the presence of war alone, but by the careful establishment of institutions capable of sustaining that loyalty over generations. Schools were founded, militias trained, trade networks organized, and infrastructure built, all measures designed to maintain the stability of the Imperium long after the immediate presence of the legions had moved onward. Communication continued to define the flow of the Imperium. Astropathic messages linked worlds across impossible distances, yet each transmission carried the risk of misinterpretation. Signals could be delayed, fragmented, or distorted by the turbulence of the warp. Leadership increasingly depended on judgment as much as instruction, as commanders, governors, and administrators acted decisively in the absence of certainty. In this way, the Imperium relied on a balance of faith and understanding, trusting that those responsible for distant regions would act in accordance with the Emperor's overarching purpose. Within these distant sectors, culture and tradition persisted even under Imperial authority. Populations often maintained customs that had survived centuries of isolation, embedding them subtly within systems of governance and daily life. Compliance did not erase identity. Rather, it reshaped it in ways consistent with imperial law while allowing familiar practices to continue. Observant officers understood these nuances, recognizing that the appearance of unity required not only enforcement but discernment. The Imperium's cohesion, like a vast living organism, depended on these quiet calibrations. Legionaries, observing the growth of systems under their watch, reflected on the broader consequences of their efforts. They were not merely conquerors, but stewards of civilizations, guiding societies in ways that would endure across generations. Each decision carried weight, and even minor misjudgments could have lasting implications. This awareness instilled a sober pride, tempered by the understanding that the Imperium's strength was inseparable from the wisdom and patience applied in its stewardship. Even as the crusade advanced, the Emperor's distant presence provided both guidance and reassurance. Though absent from the fleets themselves, his authority informed every decision, shaping strategy, policy, and doctrine. Leaders understood that obedience alone was insufficient. Judgment and loyalty were equally necessary. The Emperor's vision acted as a unifying principle, maintaining coherence across a galaxy so vast that no single individual could hope to know it entirely. Yet the vastness of the Imperium introduced constant, subtle tension. Distance, delayed information, and variation in interpretation could slowly diverge from the intended path. These divergences rarely threatened the immediate stability of a system, yet they underscored the fragility inherent in managing an empire of such scale. Awareness of this fragility fostered a culture of vigilance, patience, and continuous adjustment, ensuring that the bonds of the Imperium remained strong even when unobserved. As fleets crossed the outer reaches of star systems and legions established presence on remote worlds, the Imperium's forward motion remained deliberate and measured. Each advance, each campaign, and each administrative action was undertaken with awareness of long-term consequences. Progress was not merely the collection of compliant planets, but the careful cultivation of societies capable of sustaining loyalty and order across centuries. And so, beneath the glow of distant stars, the Imperium persisted in quiet, unrelenting expansion. Its light spread steadily across the galaxy, immense, confident, and disciplined. Yet even in triumph, those who guided it remained aware of the subtle currents that flowed beneath the surface, the variations, the small tensions, the unpredictable consequences of distance and diversity. Humanity's empire, vast and enduring, moved forward with patience and vigilance, knowing that the strength of its unity relied on both its might and its meticulous care. As the Great Crusade approached the final decades of its momentum, the Imperium had come to occupy an almost unimaginable scale. Stars and systems once thought lost to isolation were now connected by warp lanes, defended by fleets, and nurtured by governors and administrators whose work extended the Emperor's vision across light years. Humanity's reach was now vast, the unity of its civilizations assumed as much as enforced, and yet, for all the achievements, a quiet tension persisted beneath the surface. Even in the absence of open conflict, the weight of responsibility, distance, and expectation press upon every legion, fleet, and planetary administrator. The legions had grown accustomed to this balance between conquest and stewardship. They did not merely claim worlds. They oversaw their integration into a structure that spanned the galaxy. Newly compliant systems required training in Imperial law, establishment of trade and production networks, and, in many cases, the presence of Astartes advisors to maintain stability. Warriors accustomed to decisive action learned to exercise patience, teaching rather than merely commanding, observing rather than immediately intervening. It was a discipline born not of ease, but of necessity, for the permanence of the Imperium depended upon the subtle guidance of its most capable sons. Primarchs, aware of the fragility inherent in such vastness, extended their authority into all dimensions of governance. Their oversight ensured that defensive networks were resilient, trade routes remained secure, and local populations gradually internalized the principles of imperial unity. Each Primarch's influence was measured and deliberate, shaping not only military strategy but the philosophical, cultural, and practical foundations of the Imperium. In these efforts, they became more than generals. They were the architect of civilizations, overseeing societies whose endurance would span generations. Communication remained both the lifeblood and the test of the Imperium's cohesion. Astropathic signals bridged light years of void, carrying orders, reports, and intelligence across systems that might otherwise have drifted into isolation. Even so, messages could falter or arrive incomplete, demanding judgment from those who received them. Commanders, governors, and administrators acted with discretion as well as authority, interpreting guidance in the context of local circumstances. The Imperium functioned not through constant presence, but through trust in those who wielded its power at a distance. This trust extended to the populations now integrated into Imperial rule. Citizens often adapted to Imperial systems with enthusiasm, embracing the benefits of trade, governance, and protection. Yet traditions persisted, embedded within the structures of compliance. Subtle differences in culture, practice, and perspective endured, shaping the character of each world. Observant officers and astartes recognized these nuances, understanding that the true strength of the Imperium lay not in uniformity, but in the careful harmonization of diversity under a common framework of law, loyalty, and purpose. Within the fleets and across the legions, reflection on the scale of their accomplishments was inevitable. Warriors considered the worlds they had secured, the civilizations they had helped shape, and the quiet persistence required to maintain unity across such distances. They understood that the Crusade's success was not measured solely by battle victories, but by the stability, loyalty, and productivity of the populations they oversaw. In these contemplations, pride was tempered by the knowledge that their work was never complete. Vigilance, judgment, and patience were as essential as strength. Even in the quiet spaces between campaigns, the Imperium's machinery moved with unbroken precision. Administrators monitored trade, governors ensured law and compliance, and fleets maintained patrols along critical warp lanes. The Emperor's distant presence remained a unifying principle, guiding strategy, policy, and expectation across the entire galaxy. His authority shaped every decision, not as coercion, but as a standard against which the fidelity of action could be measured. Loyalty, judgment, and discipline intertwined to sustain a civilization of unparalleled scale. Yet even at this height, there was awareness of subtle vulnerability. Distance, the imperfections of communication, and the persistence of local variants created small tensions that required constant attention. They were not crises, but quiet reminders that the Imperium's unity, vast and impressive, was never absolute. The careful calibration of governance, oversight, and the Legion's presence ensured that the galaxy remained aligned, even when no single hand could guide it in its entirety. And so, beneath the soft glow of distant stars and the hum of warp drives, the Imperium advanced, immense, confident, and disciplined. Humanity's empire stretched outward, connecting countless worlds in a lattice of power, loyalty, and law. In the calm between campaigns, amid the hum of starship corridors, the glow of planetary cities, and the quiet murmur of extrapathic transmissions, a sense of enduring purpose persisted. The Great Crusade had transformed the galaxy, laying the foundations of a civilization whose scale, ambition, and unity were unprecedented. And beneath the light of distant suns, humanity's empire prepared for whatever horizons yet remained beyond reach, vast, patient, and unwavering in its slow, deliberate advance.